They say money can't buy happiness, but it can definitely buy the best legal team in Manhattan. Preston Van Doren, a man whose net worth rivals the GDP of a small country, thought he had bought his freedom too. He stood in that courtroom, surrounded by 5 sharks in Italian suits, laughing at his wife Claire, who sat alone at the defendant's table with nothing but a trembling hand and a glass of water. He thought she was weak. He thought she was finished. He thought he had already won. But Preston forgot one crucial rule of war: never corner an enemy until you know who backs them. He was about to learn that his wife's simple background was the biggest lie of all, and when those courtroom doors swung open, the silence would be deafening. The air in courtroom 4B of the Southern District of New York smelled of lemon polish and fear, mostly other people's fear. For Preston Van Doren, it smelled like victory. At 42, Preston was the kind of handsome that felt manufactured in a laboratory, jawline by design, teeth capped in blinding ceramic, and eyes the color of a frozen Atlantic wave. He didn't just sit in his chair, he occupied it like a throne. Flanking him were the partners of Sterling, Finch, and Rourke, the most vicious matrimonial law firm on the East Coast. Their billable hours alone cost more than the average American made in a decade. On the other side of the aisle, the scene was pitifully stark. Claire Van Doren sat alone. She wore a simple navy dress off the rack, likely from a department store sale rack 3 seasons ago. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, fraying bun. There were no paralegals whispering in her ear, no stacks of leather-bound binders, no interns passing her notes. Just Claire, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white. "Mr. Van Doren," Judge Arthur P. Minton rumbled, peering over his spectacles. The judge was a man of procedure, known for his impatience with theatrics. "We are 20 minutes into this session. Does the respondent intend to wait for counsel, or are we witnessing a delay tactic?" Preston chuckled. It was a low, resonant sound that bounced off the mahogany walls. He leaned over to his lead attorney, Harrison Rourke, a man known as the Butcher of Broadway, and whispered loud enough for the stenographer to hear. "She's waiting for a miracle, Harrison. Or maybe she's waiting for a coupon." The legal team snickered. It was a cruel, practiced sound. "Order," Judge Minton said, though he didn't bang the gavel. He looked at Claire with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Mrs. Van Doren, I will ask you one last time. You refused the court-appointed counsel. You fired the mediator. Do you have representation, or are you proceeding pro se?" Claire looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, heavy with the weight of 5 years of psychological warfare. I'm expecting someone, Your Honor." Preston spun his pen on the table. "Your Honor," he interjected, his voice smooth as aged scotch. "With all due respect to my wife's optimism, this is a waste of the court's time. We have a prenuptial agreement that is ironclad. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized. She gets the apartment in Queens and the 2018 Lexus. I keep the assets, the IP, and the Hamptons estate. She knows this. She's just dragging this out because she knows once that gavel bangs, the credit cards stop working." "Mr. Van Doren, speak through your counsel," the judge warned, though he looked at the clock. Harrison Rourke stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, my client is frustrated, and rightfully so. Mrs. Van Doren has had 6 months to retain counsel. We are moving for a summary judgment on the validity of the prenup. There is no lawyer coming. There is no strategy here other than obstruction." The courtroom gallery, filled with a handful of reporters hungry for the gossip of the tech titan divorce, murmured. They were scribbling furiously, "Billionaire mocking wife." It was good for headlines, bad for Claire. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. She said she would be here. Preston laughed openly this time. He turned his entire body toward her, ignoring the decorum of the court. Who, Claire? Your mother? The librarian from Ohio? Is she going to come in here and shush us into submission? Is she going to throw the Dewey Decimal System at Harrison Rourke? The paralegals covered their mouths to hide their grins. Even the bailiff looked away, embarrassed for her. My mother is not a librarian, Claire said, her voice trembling but gaining a surprising steeliness. Right, Preston sneered. She's a retired administrator. I remember. I met her once at the wedding. Quiet woman. Wore a polyester suit. I think she was afraid to drink the champagne because she thought we'd charge her for it. That's enough, Judge Minton snapped. Mrs. Van Doren, if your counsel does not walk through those doors in the next 60 seconds, I am ruling on the motion for summary judgment. I have a murder trial starting at 2 p.m. I will not have my docket clogged by domestic stalling. 60 seconds, Preston whispered to Rourke. Watch her crumble. Claire looked at the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't look at the judge. She just stared at the brass handles. Please, she thought, don't let him win. The clock on the wall ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Preston checked his Rolex. 30 seconds, darling. You should have taken the settlement. The apartment in Queens has a lovely view of the parking lot. 10 seconds. Judge Minton raised his gavel. Mrs. Van Doren, it appears you are representing yourself. Mr. Rourke, you may proceed with your motion. Thank you, Your Honor, Rourke boomed, stepping into the center of the room. We submit into Evidence Exhibit A, the prenuptial agreement dated. Bam! The sound wasn't the gavel. It was the double doors at the back of the courtroom. They didn't just open, they were thrown wide with a force that rattled the frames. The air in the room shifted instantly. A cold draft swept in from the hallway, silencing Harrison Rourke mid-sentence. Every head turned. Preston swiveled in his chair, a smirk ready on his lips, expecting a bewildered old woman in a cardigan. But the figure standing in the doorway was not bewildered. And she certainly wasn't wearing a cardigan. To understand the silence in that courtroom, you have to understand the noise that had filled Claire's life for the last 5 years. Claire Bennett had met Preston Van Doren at a charity gala in Chicago. She wasn't a socialite. She was working the event as a coordinator for a literacy non-profit. She was 24, bright-eyed, and believed that wealthy people were just like everyone else, only with better shoes. Preston had charmed her with the efficiency of a predator. He didn't woo her, he acquired her. He was fascinated by her quaint background. She was the daughter of a single mother who lived a quiet, reclusive life in a small town outside of Columbus. Claire had no debts, no scandals, and most importantly to Preston, no connections. He viewed her as a blank slate, a pretty accessory that wouldn't talk back. The isolation started slowly. First, it was the concern about her friends. They're just using you for my money, Claire. I'm the only one who really sees you. Then, it was the subtle digs at her intelligence. Don't worry your pretty head about the investments, darling. You wouldn't understand the nuance of offshore holding companies. By the time they were married, Claire was living in a gilded cage. The penthouse in Tribeca was 6,000 square feet, but she felt like she couldn't breathe in any of the rooms. The breaking point didn't come with a shout or a slap. It came with a signature. 3 months ago, Preston had come home late, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. He had tossed a document on the kitchen island. Sign this, Claire. It's an amendment to the prenup. Just tax stuff. Claire had hesitated. Should I have a lawyer look at it? Preston had laughed, that same laugh he was using in the courtroom now. A lawyer? With what money? I control the accounts, Claire. Besides, who would you call? Your mother. She probably thinks a retainer is something you put on your teeth. He had mocked her mother constantly. To Preston, Margaret Bennett was the ultimate symbol of mediocrity. A woman who lived in a small paid-off house, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and sent handwritten cards for birthdays. Preston despised her because she refused to be impressed by him. She never asked for money, never asked to stay at the penthouse, and when she looked at him, her eyes were dangerously flat. Claire hadn't signed the amendment. Instead, she packed a bag. When she told Preston she was leaving, he didn't scream. He just smiled. Go ahead. But remember, the original prenup leaves you with nothing if you initiate the divorce. I have Harrison Rourke on retainer. He eats people like you for breakfast. Claire had called her mother that night, sobbing from a cheap motel room in Jersey City. He's going to destroy me, Mum, Claire had cried. He says I have nobody. He says I can't afford a lawyer. He's right. I have $400 in my checking account. On the other end of the line, there was a long silence. Margaret Bennett's voice, usually soft and comforting, sounded different that night. It sounded like a heavy door closing. Did he say that? Margaret asked. Did he say you have nobody? Yes. He laughed at you, Mum. He said you were just a librarian. Another silence. Then a sigh, not of defeat, but of resignation, the kind of sigh a soldier makes before picking up a rifle they promised they'd never touch again. Claire, her mother said, wipe your face, put on your navy dress, go to the court date on Tuesday. But I don't have a lawyer. You don't need a lawyer, Claire, Margaret said. You need me. Mum, please, you don't understand how the law works in New York. These men are sharks. I know exactly how the law works, Claire, better than you think. Just promise me one thing. When you walk into that courtroom, keep your head up. Do not look at your shoes. You are a Bennett. It's time you learned what that actually means. Claire hadn't understood. She thought her mother was just giving her a pep talk. She didn't know that her mother had hung up the phone, walked to the back of her modest closet, and pulled out a dusty, locked briefcase that hadn't seen the light of day since 1995. Inside wasn't knitting supplies or old photos. Inside was a Rolodex of names that could topple governments, a bar association card that was supposedly expired, and a singular, terrifying reputation that had been buried for 3 decades. Back in the courtroom, the doors were still vibrating from the impact. Preston Van Doren squinted against the light from the hallway. Is that the security guard? He joked, though his voice wavered slightly. A woman stepped into the light. She was wearing a suit, but it wasn't polyester. It was a vintage Chanel, black as midnight, tailored so sharply it could cut glass. She wore heels that clicked against the floorboards with the rhythm of a ticking bomb. Her grey hair wasn't in a messy bun. It was styled in a sleek, powerful bob. But it was the briefcase she carried that made Harrison Rourke, the butcher of Broadway, drop his pen. It was an oxblood leather briefcase with gold initials stamped near the handle. C.W. Harrison Rourke went pale. He knew that briefcase. Every partner at a top-tier firm over the age of 50 knew that briefcase. It was the stuff of law school nightmares. The woman walked past the gallery, past the bailiff, who instinctively stepped aside, and stopped right behind Claire. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. She looked at the judge, then slowly turned her gaze to Preston. Her eyes were cold, hard, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice projecting to the back of the room without a microphone. Traffic on the bridge was murder. Unlike the case Mr. Rourke is trying to build. Preston blinked. "Margaret? What are you doing here?" This is a closed session for counsel and parties only. Get out." Margaret Bennet smiled. But it wasn't a motherly smile. It was a shark's smile. "My name," she said, unclasping the briefcase with a loud snap, "is not Margaret Bennet. That is the name I used to raise my daughter in peace." She pulled out a document, heavy and bound in blue legal backing. "My name is Catherine Winslow, senior partner of Winslow, Craft and Stern, and I am entering my appearance as counsel for the respondent." Harrison Rourke choked on air. "Winslow, the Catherine Winslow. You're dead. You died in a plane crash in '98. "I retired," she corrected him, sliding her reading glasses up her nose. "Because I got bored of beating amateurs like you, Harrison. But—" She looked at Preston, who was now trembling in his custom Italian leather shoes. "It seems my son-in-law requires a lesson in humility, and I am coming out of retirement to teach it." She looked up at the judge. "Ready to proceed, Your Honor?" The silence in the courtroom was shattered by the sharp sound of Harrison Rourke clearing his throat. It sounded like a man choking on a fishbone. "Your Honor," Rourke stammered, his face flushing a mottled red. "This is highly irregular. Catherine Winslow. As I said, the legal community believed Ms. Winslow to be deceased. We need verification of identity, bar status, standing. I am currently in good standing with the New York bar, the London bar, and God," Catherine interrupted, flipping open a folder. "My license was never terminated, merely inactive. I reactivated it at 8 a.m. this morning. The fees were paid. The stamp is wet. Would you like to smell the ink, Harrison?" Judge Minton, who had looked bored 5 minutes ago, was now leaning forward, fascinated. "Mr. Rourke, if this is indeed Miss Winslow, and judging by the fact that you look like you've seen a ghost, I believe it is, then the respondent has counsel. Proceed." Preston Van Doren leaned over to his lawyer, his whisper furious. "Harrison, fix this. Who cares who she is? She's been living in a cornfield for 20 years. She's rusty. Destroy her." Rourke looked at his client with genuine panic. "You don't understand, Preston. She isn't just a lawyer. In the 90s, they called her the guillotine. She didn't just win cases. She bankrupted the opposing firms. She dismantled Standard Oil and Gas in 3 days." Catherine ignored the whispering. She turned to Claire, whose face was a mask of shock. "Mum," Claire whispered. You were a lawyer?" "I was the lawyer, darling," Catherine said softly, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "And I gave it up because I wanted to raise a daughter who valued kindness over winning. I see I succeeded with you. But now," she turned back to Preston, "now I have to be the other person again." Catherine walked to the center of the room. She didn't use the podium. She paced, claiming the space. "Your Honor, Mr. Rourke has moved for a summary judgment based on a prenuptial agreement signed 5 years ago. He claims it is ironclad." "It is," Preston barked out, unable to help himself. Catherine stopped and looked at him. "Mr. Van Doren, did you disclose all assets at the time of signing? Specifically the holdings in Archipelago Trust, a shell company registered in the Seychelles?" Preston froze. His eyes darted to Rourke. "I see the silence," Catherine continued. "Fraudulent inducement renders a contract void ab initio. But let's put the fraud aside for a moment. Let's talk about duress. Mr. Rourke, you drafted this agreement, correct?" "I did," Rourke said, regaining some composure. "Standard boilerplate." "Standard." Catherine pulled a sheet from her briefcase. "You had my daughter sign this document at 2 a.m. on the day of the wedding, while she was recovering from the flu without independent counsel present. In Matthews v. Matthews, the Second Circuit ruled that presenting a prenup less than 48 hours before a ceremony, constitutes coercive timing. That case law is 20 years old, Rourke argued. Old law is good law, Catherine shot back. But if you want something newer, let's look at Van Doren v. Decency, a case I am building right now. Your Honor, I am moving to dismiss the summary judgment request. Furthermore, I am filing an emergency motion for a forensic audit of Mr. Van Doren's finances. If he wants to stick to the prenup, he needs to prove he didn't lie when he signed it. Objection, Rourke shouted. This is a fishing expedition. No, Harrison, Catherine smiled, and it was terrifying. It's not a fishing expedition. I brought the dynamite. I don't need to fish. Judge Minton hid a smile behind his hand. Motion for summary judgment denied. Motion for forensic audit granted. Mr. Van Doren, you will open your books to Miss Winslow. All of them. Even the ones in the Seychelles. We reconvene in 1 week. The gavel banged. Preston stood up, his face purple. He pointed a finger at Catherine. You think you can just walk in here and scare me? I have billions. I can buy this courthouse. I can bury you in paperwork until you're dead. Catherine snapped her briefcase shut. She walked up to Preston until she was inches from his expensive tie. She was shorter than him, but she loomed like a giant. Preston, she said, her voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Claire's arms stand up. You have money. I have files. I have files on the judges. I have files on the senators you bribe. And I have files on where your money actually comes from. Do not threaten me with paperwork. I invented the paperwork. She took Claire's arm. Come on, Claire. Let's go get lunch. I'm craving a steak. Rare. As they walked out, the reporters outside the doors, who had been tipped off by a mysterious text message sent 10 minutes earlier, swarmed them. The flashbulbs popped like lightning. Miss Winslow! Miss Winslow! Is it true you're back? Are you taking on the Van Doren empire? Catherine paused on the courthouse steps, Claire trembling beside her. Catherine put on sunglasses, shielding her eyes. I'm not taking on the empire, she told the cameras. I'm foreclosing on it. The apartment Catherine took Claire to wasn't the modest house in Ohio. It was a suite at the St. Regis. Mum, Claire said, sitting on the plush velvet sofa, still in her court dress. I don't understand. If you were this titan, why did we live in a 2-bedroom ranch house? Why did we clip coupons? Why did you let me struggle? Catherine poured 2 cups of tea. Her hands, which had been steady as stone in the courtroom, were shaking slightly now. She sat down and sighed, the shark persona melting away to reveal the mother. Because the world I lived in, Claire, was toxic. My husband, your father, didn't die of a heart attack like I told you. He was a corporate whistleblower. He was killed because of a case I was working on. After that, I realized that being Catherine Winslow put a target on your back. So I buried her. I became Margaret. I wanted you to be safe. I wanted you to be normal. Claire teared up. But I married a monster. You didn't know, Catherine said fiercely. Monsters don't look like monsters, Claire. They look like Preston Van Doren. They look like princes until they lock the tower door. But you're out now, and I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone again. The next 3 days were a blur of war room tactics. Catherine turned the hotel suite into a command center. She didn't hire a team. She made 3 phone calls. The first was to a man named Silas in Zurich. The second was to a woman named Viper in the Cayman Islands. The third was to the Department of Justice, specifically to an old friend who was now the Attorney General. On Thursday, the discovery documents from Preston's team arrived. It was a classic document dump. 50 boxes of paper delivered to the hotel room, intended to overwhelm them. Preston's team thought 2 women couldn't possibly sort through 50,000 pages in 48 hours. They were wrong. Catherine didn't read them. She scanned the barcodes on the boxes. "He's sloppy," Catherine muttered, tossing a binder onto the floor. "Harrison Rourke is lazy. He didn't sanitize the metadata." "What do you mean?" Claire asked. She was trying to help, sorting files into piles. "Look at this." Catherine pointed to a redacted bank statement. They blacked out the account numbers with a marker, but they didn't flatten the PDF digital file before printing the master list. If I hold this up to the light, see that? Claire squinted. Through the black ink, she could see faint numbers. "Account 884, Bravo, Bank of Cyprus," Catherine recited. "He's moving money through Cyprus to avoid US taxes. That's a federal crime, Claire. That's not just grounds for a bigger settlement. That's RICO territory." Claire felt a cold knot in her stomach. "If you expose this, he goes to jail." "Yes, he'll kill us," Claire whispered. "Mum, you don't know him. When he gets cornered, he gets violent. He has security guards who are basically mercenaries." Catherine walked over to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. "Let him try. He thinks he's playing chess, Claire. But he doesn't know I'm playing poker, and I have 4 aces." Just then, Claire's phone buzzed. It was a text from Preston. "Let's talk. Without your mother. Meet me at the penthouse. I can make this all go away. I'll give you 10 million. Just stop her. If you don't, things will get ugly for the librarian." Claire showed the phone to Catherine. Catherine read it and smiled grimly. 10 million? He's scared. The price just went up. "I'm not going," Claire said. "No," Catherine corrected. "You are going, and I'm going with you, but not in the way he thinks." The penthouse in Tribeca was a monument to ego. Floor-to-ceiling glass, black marble floors, and art that cost more than most hospitals. Preston was waiting in the living room. He held a tumbler of scotch. He looked tired. The stock price of Van Doren Industries had dropped 14% since Catherine's appearance in court. The market hated uncertainty, and Catherine Winslow was the ultimate variable. When the elevator opened, Claire stepped out. She was wearing a new suit Catherine had bought her, white, crisp, authoritative. "You came," Preston said, swirling his drink. "Smart girl. Where's the old battle axe?" "Right here." A voice came from the speaker system of the apartment. Preston jumped. "What the hell?" "I'm in the lobby, Preston." Catherine's voice boomed through the smart home intercom. "I didn't want to ruin your expensive rugs with my shoes. Besides, I prefer to negotiate via microphone. It's easier to record." Preston turned to Claire, his eyes narrowing. "You wired the apartment?" "No," Claire said, her voice steady. "You did. You installed the surveillance system to spy on me, remember? You connected it to your phone. Mum just hacked your password. It was Preston, by the way. Very creative." Preston smashed his glass against the wall. Shards of crystal rained down on the marble. "You think this is funny? You think you can embarrass me? I will ruin you, Claire. I will release the medical records, the ones from when you had anxiety. I'll paint you as unstable. No judge will give you a dime." "Go ahead," Claire said. She surprised herself. She wasn't shaking. "Release them. Tell the world you drove your wife to a breakdown. It fits the narrative Mum is building." Preston lunged at her. It happened in slow motion. He grabbed Claire by the arm, his grip bruising. "Call her off. Call off the audit." Suddenly, the elevator doors pinged open again. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't lawyers. They weren't police. They were Van Doren security, but they weren't looking at Claire. They were looking at Preston. Mr. Van Doren, the lead guard said, we have orders to escort you out. Preston laughed, a manic sound. Escort me? I pay you, you idiots. Throw this woman out. Actually, the guard said, you don't pay us. The board of directors pays us. And as of 10 minutes ago, the board voted to suspend you as CEO pending an investigation into... He looked at a text message on his phone. Embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit perjury. Preston's face went white. He dropped Claire's arm. The board? They can't do that. I own 51% of the voting shares. Not anymore. Catherine's voice came over the intercom again. Check your email, Preston. Preston scrambled for his phone. He opened his email. There was a notification from the SEC. Asset freeze order. Department of Justice. You see, Catherine explained, her voice echoing like a deity in the room. When I found the Cyprus accounts yesterday, I didn't just tell the judge. I called a few friends at the SEC. Since the assets were obtained through fraud, they are currently frozen, which means your voting rights are suspended, which means the board, who, by the way, have hated your arrogance for years, finally had the leverage they needed to oust you. Preston sank onto the white leather sofa. He looked small. The giant of industry was shrinking before their eyes. You destroyed my company, he whispered. No, Claire said, standing over him. I just took back what you stole. The company will survive. You won't. Get out, Preston, the guard said. The board wants you off the premises. This isn't over, Preston screamed as the guards hoisted him up by his elbows. I have friends. I have the governor. I have the Russian mob. You have nothing, Catherine yelled over the intercom. And Preston, if you contact the Russian mob, tell the butcher that Catherine Winslow says hello. He still owes me a favor from 1992. Preston was dragged into the elevator, kicking and screaming like a toddler. When the doors closed, silence returned to the penthouse. Claire let out a long breath. She looked around the apartment that had been her prison. It felt different now. It felt empty. The elevator opened one last time. Catherine stepped out, holding her briefcase. She looked around the penthouse with distaste. Tacky, she remarked. Too much chrome. Mum, Claire said, running to hug her. Is it really over? Catherine hugged her daughter tight, smelling the fear leaving her body. The business part? Yes. He's finished corporately, Catherine said. But a wounded animal is dangerous, Claire. He has nothing left to lose. And that makes him unpredictable. Catherine pulled away and looked Claire in the eye. Her expression was grave. We won the battle, but the war is about to get physical. We need to leave New York. Tonight. Why? Claire asked, panic rising again. Because, Catherine said, pulling a piece of paper from her pocket. While you were talking to him, I received this. It was a process server notice, but it wasn't for divorce court. It was a subpoena for Margaret Bennett. He didn't just call his lawyers, Catherine said. He found my old enemies. The people who killed your father know I'm alive. The black sedan tore down the highway, heading north toward the Catskills. The city lights of Manhattan faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the crushing darkness of the unlit interstate. Claire drove. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Beside her, Catherine was stripping the SIM cards out of their phones and snapping them in half. Mum, talk to me, Claire demanded, her voice rising with panic. Who killed Dad? You said he died of a heart attack. You said he had high cholesterol. Catherine rolled down the window and tossed the broken plastic shards into the wind. I lied. I lied to protect you. Your father, David, was an auditor. In 1998, he found a discrepancy in a massive construction conglomerate's books. They were laundering money for the Volkov syndicate. Russian organized crime. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Preston mentioned the Russian mob. "Preston is an idiot," Catherine said, her tone clinical, detached. He thought he was just using their money to prop up his failing tech stocks. He didn't realize that when you take their money, you become their employee. When I froze his assets today, I didn't just bankrupt Preston. I froze their money. And they don't file lawsuits, Claire. They file death certificates. So where are we going? To the one place David prepared for us, a cabin near Woodstock. It's off the grid. No internet, no smart meters. It's a bunker disguised as a vacation home. They drove in silence for 2 hours. The rain turned to sleet, lashing against the windshield. When they finally turned onto the gravel driveway, the cabin looked abandoned. Dust covered the windows. But inside, Catherine moved with familiarity. She flipped a breaker, and the hum of a backup generator shuddered to life. "We stay here until the FBI team I contacted secures the perimeter," Catherine said, pulling a heavy curtain shut. "Agent Miller is flying in from D.C. He's the only one I trust. And if Preston comes?" "Preston won't come alone," Catherine said, checking the lock on the heavy oak door. She was right. 3 hours later, at 2 a.m., the motion sensor lights outside flooded the yard. Claire, who had been dozing on a dusty sofa, jumped up. "Mom!" Catherine was already at the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. 3 SUVs were idling at the edge of the property. Men were getting out. They wore tactical gear. In the lead, looking disheveled and frantic, was Preston Van Doren. He held a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. "He tracked the car," Catherine cursed. "The GPS in the dashboard. I forgot the damn LoJack." "What do we do?" Claire whispered. "There are 6 of them." "We don't run," Catherine said. She walked to the fireplace, reached up into the chimney, and pulled out a loose brick. Behind it was a small, velvet-wrapped package. She unwrapped it to reveal a snub-nosed .38 revolver. "Mum, get in the cellar, Claire. Lock the door from the inside. Do not come out until I say the code word." "What's the code word?" "Dewey Decimal." "Mum, I'm not leaving you." "Go!" Catherine's voice wasn't a request. It was an order from a woman who had stared down death before. Claire scrambled into the small root cellar beneath the kitchen rug. She pulled the trapdoor shut and threw the bolt just as the front door of the cabin was kicked in. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the floorboards. "Catherine!" Preston's voice screamed. He sounded drunk or manic or both. "Come out, you old witch! You have the encryption keys for the accounts. Give them to me." From the darkness of the cellar, Claire listened, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, Preston." Catherine's voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "You brought guests. How rude." "Cut the crap," Preston yelled. "These gentlemen want their money. If you don't unlock the accounts right now, they're going to burn this cabin down with us inside." "They can try," Catherine said. "But you should know, Preston. I didn't come here to hide. I came here to wait." "Wait for what?" "For the wiretap to finish recording this confession." A heavy silence fell over the room above. "Check the house," a thick, accented voice shouted. Likely the syndicate leader. "Find the girl." Heavy boots stomped across the floorboards right above Claire's head. She held her breath, pressing her hand over her mouth. Dust filtered down onto her face. "She's not here," Catherine said. "I sent her away hours ago." "Liar!" Preston shrieked. "She's soft. She wouldn't leave you." "Found it!" a man shouted. The cellar door was ripped open. Light flooded in. A man with a scar across his face reached down and grabbed Claire by the hair, hauling her up into the kitchen. "Let her go!" Catherine stepped forward, raising the revolver. "Drop it, Grandma," the syndicate leader sneered, pointing a submachine gun at Claire's head. "Or the daughter dies first." Catherine froze. For the first time, the Iron Lady looked defeated. She slowly lowered the gun and placed it on the floor. "Good," Preston laughed, stepping forward. He looked deranged. His expensive suit was muddy, his eyes wild. "Now unlock the laptop, transfer the funds, then we have a little accident. A gas leak, perhaps." Catherine looked at Preston with profound pity. "You really don't see it, do you?" "See what?" "You aren't the partner, Preston. You're the loose end." The syndicate leader nodded to one of his men. The man raised his weapon. Not at Catherine, but at Preston. Preston's eyes went wide. "Wait, what are you doing? I brought you to them." "You brought us heat," the leader spat. "Your wife's public spectacle brought the FBI into our business. You are a liability." "No!" Preston screamed. Crash! The windows of the cabin exploded inward. Red laser sights cut through the dust and smoke. "FBI, drop your weapons! Down! Down! Down!" Flashbang grenades detonated with blinding white light. The room erupted into chaos. The syndicate men, blinded and disoriented, fired wildly into the ceiling, but the tactical team swarming through the doors and windows overwhelmed them in seconds. Claire was thrown to the floor by an agent shielding her body. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw her mother. Catherine hadn't flinched. She stood amidst the broken glass and smoke, watching as Preston was tackled to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged screaming out the door. Agent Miller, a grey-haired man in a windbreaker, walked over to Catherine. "You cut it close, Kate," he said. "I needed them all in the same room, Miller," Catherine replied, brushing dust off her Chanel suit. "RICO charges don't stick unless you catch the whole conspiracy together." Claire crawled over to her mother, shaking uncontrollably. Catherine knelt down and wrapped her arms around her. "It's over," Catherine whispered. "The ghost is gone." 6 months later, the cherry blossoms were blooming in Washington Square Park, but inside the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse, the atmosphere was as cold as a morgue. This wasn't just a sentencing hearing. It had become the cultural event of the year. The fall of Preston Van Doren was no longer just a business story. It was a morality play broadcast on every major network. The tech titan who had sneered at his wife's poverty was now facing the full weight of the United States government. The courtroom was packed to capacity. A lottery system had been instituted for the public gallery seats. In the front row, Claire Van Doren sat with a posture that would have made a ballerina envious. The nervous, fraying woman in the navy dress was gone. In her place sat a woman wearing a tailored cream power suit, her hair cut in a sharp, modern bob that framed a face no longer hiding from the world. Next to her sat Catherine Winslow. She was knitting. The rhythmic click, click, click of her needles was the only sound in the room before the bailiff announced the judge. It was a psychological tactic, and it was working. Every time Preston looked back from the defense table, his eyes twitched at the sound. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Arthur P. Minton swept into the room. He looked older than he had 6 months ago. This case had been a marathon of motions, counter-motions, and revelations that had shaken New York high society to its core. Preston Van Doren stood up. The transformation was shocking. The custom Italian suits were gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His once perfectly coiffed hair was thinning and grey, and his skin had the pallor of a man who hadn't seen direct sunlight since the raid in the Catskills. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, a desperate criminal. His defense table was a lonely island. Harrison Rourke was gone, indicted as a co-conspirator and currently awaiting his own trial in a separate federal facility. In his place stood a court-appointed public defender, a young man named Mr. Gorski, who looked terrified to be part of the most high-profile case of the decade. We are here for sentencing in the matter of the United States versus Preston Van Doren, Judge Minton said, adjusting his glasses. The defendant has been found guilty on 42 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit violence. Mr. Gorski, do you have a statement before I pass sentence? Mr. Gorski cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. Your Honor, my client acknowledges mistakes were made. However, we ask the court to consider that Mr. Van Doren was under immense pressure from the Volkov syndicate. He was a victim of extortion, not a willing participant. He built a company that employed thousands. We ask for leniency. We ask for the minimum mandatory sentence. Preston nodded vigorously, looking at the jury box, which was now empty, trying to appeal to the judge's humanity. Judge Minton peered over his spectacles. Is that all? Yes, Your Honor. Does the prosecution wish to speak? The Assistant U.S. Attorney stood up, but before she could speak, she gestured to the gallery. Your Honor, we have several victim impact statements, but there is one voice that the court needs to hear. The government yields the floor to Mrs. Claire Van Doren. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Preston whipped his head around. He hadn't expected this. Claire stood up. She touched her mother's arm briefly, a silent transfer of strength, and walked to the podium. She didn't bring notes. She adjusted the microphone, her eyes locking onto Preston's. For 5 years, Claire began, her voice low but carrying to the back of the room without a tremor. I lived in a prison made of gold. I was told I was worthless. I was told I was lucky to be allowed in the room. I was isolated from my family, from my friends, and eventually from my own sense of self. She paused, taking a breath. Mr. Van Doren's counsel speaks of the pressure he was under. He speaks of the jobs he created. But he doesn't speak of the architecture of fear he built in our home. He used his wealth not as a tool for good, but as a weapon to silence anyone who dared to question him. He told me that because I had no money, I had no rights. He told me that justice was a luxury I couldn't afford. Preston shifted in his seat, his chains rattling. Claire, please, he whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. I am not finished. Claire's voice cracked like a whip, silencing him instantly. He was wrong, Your Honor, Claire continued, turning to the judge. Justice isn't a luxury. It's a requirement, and it shouldn't matter if you have $1 billion or $400 in your checking account. If we let men like Preston Van Doren buy their way out of consequences, we aren't just failing the victims, we are failing the very idea of the law. I am not asking for vengeance, Your Honor. I am asking for the one thing my husband never gave me. I am asking for accountability. She stepped back from the podium. The room was so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming. Judge Minton looked at Claire for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Van Doren. The judge turned his gaze to Preston. The look was withering. Mr. Van Doren, please rise. Preston stood, his legs shaking. He gripped the table for support. In my 30 years on the bench, Judge Minton began, his voice rumbling like approaching thunder, I have seen drug dealers, murderers, and thieves, but rarely have I seen a man with so many advantages choose a path of such deliberate malice. You had the world at your feet, and you chose to sell it to a crime syndicate for a slightly higher profit margin. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand. The argument that you were a victim is rejected. You were the architect. You invited the wolves in because you thought you could command them. And when your wife, a woman you swore to protect, threatened your illicit empire, you didn't seek divorce. You sought to destroy her. You conspired to have her and her mother killed. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Preston blurted out. "It was just a threat." "The bullet holes in the cabin walls say otherwise," Judge Minton snapped. "Mr. Van Doren, for the crimes of racketeering and conspiracy, I sentence you to 50 years in a federal penitentiary." Preston gasped. The air left his body. 50? I'll be 90 years old. "Furthermore," the judge continued, ignoring the outburst, "I am ordering the immediate forfeiture of all personal assets. The Hamptons estate, the Tribeca penthouse, the fleet of vehicles, and the offshore holdings in Cyprus and the Seychelles are hereby seized." The judge picked up a second document. "The court also awards punitive damages to the victims. The liquidation of Van Doren Industries will create a restitution fund. The remainder of the estate, estimated at approximately $2.1 billion after federal seizures, is awarded to the plaintiff, Mrs. Claire Van Doren, as settlement for the fraudulent prenuptial agreement and emotional distress." The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. Bang! Court is adjourned. Pandemonium erupted. Reporters scrambled over the benches. Preston slumped onto the table, sobbing into his hands. My money, he moaned, oblivious to the fact that he had just lost his freedom. 2 U.S. Marshals moved in, hauling Preston to his feet. As they dragged him toward the side door leading to the holding cells, he looked back one last time. He locked eyes with Catherine Winslow. Catherine stopped knitting. She lowered her sunglasses just an inch, looking him dead in the eye. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just offered him a small, polite nod, the kind you give to a waiter who has just cleared a dirty plate. The door slammed shut, and Preston Van Doren was gone. An hour later, the steps of the courthouse were a sea of microphones. Every major news outlet was there: CNN, BBC, Fox, MSNBC. When Claire and Catherine emerged, the flashbulbs were blinding. Security guards had to hold back the throng. "Claire! Claire! How does it feel to be the wealthiest woman in New York?" a reporter from the Times shouted. Claire stepped up to the bank of microphones. She looked out at the city, a city that had once terrified her. "I am not the wealthiest woman in New York," Claire said into the microphones, "because the money isn't mine." A hush fell over the crowd. "I am announcing today the formation of the Bennett Winslow Legal Defense Fund," Claire declared. 90% of the assets seized from Preston Van Doren will be placed into a blind trust. Its sole purpose is to provide top-tier legal representation to victims of domestic and financial abuse who cannot afford to fight back. We are going to hire the best lawyers in the country, and we are going to offer their services for free. The crowd gasped. "No woman," Claire said, her voice catching slightly before strengthening, "should ever have to sit alone in a courtroom while a man laughs at her because she can't afford a lawyer. That ends today." "And the remaining 10%?" another reporter asked. "What about you?" Claire turned to look at her mother. Catherine was standing a few feet back, holding the battered oxblood briefcase that had started it all. She looked content. For the first time in 20 years, she didn't look like she was checking the exits for threats. "The remaining 10%, Claire smiled, will be used to fund a very long, very overdue retirement for my senior counsel." Catherine stepped forward, deadpan as ever. "I'm thinking of taking up a hobby," she told the press. "Maybe gardening. Or perhaps I'll write a book on how to dismantle a conglomerate in 3 days. I haven't decided." Laughter rippled through the press corps. "Ms. Winslow," a reporter yelled, "is the guillotine really retired?" Catherine adjusted her Chanel jacket. She looked at the reporter, then at Claire. "The guillotine is retired," Catherine said softly. "But my daughter, she's just getting started. And let me tell you, She's much scarier than I ever was." With that, Catherine took Claire's arm. "Come on," Catherine whispered, turning them away from the cameras. "The show is over, and I am still craving that steak. Rare, and maybe a bottle of that Bordeaux Preston was saving for his 50th birthday. I believe the marshals let me keep a few souvenirs." "You stole his wine?" Claire laughed, the sound light and free. "I liquidated an asset," Catherine corrected with a wink. They walked down the steps and into the bustling city. The black sedan waiting for them wasn't fleeing into the night this time. It was taking them to lunch. Preston Van Doren had been right about one thing. Money was power. But he had been wrong about where that power came from. It didn't come from hoarding it. It came from knowing exactly when to drop the hammer. Preston Van Doren spent his life thinking that the person with the most expensive suit in the room was the most powerful. He never realized that the true power in that courtroom wasn't his money. It was the quiet, unbreakable bond between a mother who would burn the world down for her child and a daughter who learned how to strike the match. They took his arrogance, his fortune, and his freedom, and they turned it into a shield for thousands of other women. Preston sits in a cell today, but the Bennett Winslow Fund is out there right now, ensuring that the next time a bully tries to mock his wife for having no lawyer, he might just find himself staring down the barrel of $1 billion defense team. If this story of justice and redemption gave you chills, please smash that like button. It really helps the algorithm share this message. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a saga. Share this video with the strongest woman you know. And tell me in the comments, do you think 50 years was enough for Preston, or did he get off easy? Let's talk about it below.